The morning light was barely breaking through the blinds when I found the envelope, thin, yellowed, and tucked so deep behind Thomas's dresser that dust clung to my fingers as I pulled it out. My heart kicked hard, the way it does when something inside you knows the truth before your mind catches up. The paper felt colder than it should have, and for a moment I just stared at my own shaking hands, wondering why dread crawled up my spine. If you've ever trusted someone so completely that you never imagined they could hollow your life out from the inside, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Maybe you'll understand what I felt in that moment. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I found the envelope on an ordinary afternoon, tucked behind a stack of winter blankets I had been meaning to sort through for months. I remember freezing, my fingers still pressed against the soft fabric as my eyes locked onto the corner of that thick, cream-colored paper. My name wasn't written on it, yet something in me tightened, almost as if my body understood the truth before my mind caught up. For a moment, all I could hear was my own breathing, quick and uneven, echoing through a house that had always felt familiar and safe. As I held the envelope, a strange heaviness settled in my chest. It reminded me of those small moments over the years when something felt off and I brushed it aside, convincing myself I was imagining things. A late-night phone call he stepped outside to take, a sudden business trip that didn't match the season, a coldness in his eyes during arguments he insisted were nothing. The weight of the envelope pulled all those memories into sharp focus. My hands trembled as I opened it, expecting— I don't even know what I expected. But I knew, with a clarity that made my stomach twist, that life as I understood it was slipping out from under me. Inside was a stack of documents I didn't recognize, but I didn't need to understand them yet to feel the betrayal pulsing through my veins. Something had been hidden from me, carefully, deliberately. And before I can explain what I found, I need to tell you who I was before this moment and why the truth hit me as hard as it did. Looking back on those years almost feels like watching someone else's life. For so long, everything between Thomas and me appeared steady, predictable, even comforting in its routine. We built a home in a quiet neighborhood outside Denver, worked our jobs, shared our small traditions, and I told myself that this was what a lasting marriage looked like. I held on to that belief with both hands, partly because it felt safe and partly because I wanted it to be true. He used to mention a distant cousin who always seemed to need help. Trips that popped up at inconvenient times were folded into that story, wrapped in explanations about family obligations and unexpected emergencies. I remember telling myself that compassion was one of his strengths, and I wanted to see it that way. Even when something tugged at my intuition, I would push the feeling aside and remind myself that doubt had no place in a healthy relationship. But the red flags were there, scattered quietly across the years. A work trip that stretched longer than he initially said, a credit card charge that didn't match the places he told me he had been, a tightening in his voice when I asked simple questions. I always softened my own concerns, convincing myself I was overthinking and that every marriage had its odd moments. I can see now how denial weaves itself into daily life so subtly that you barely notice it happening, little by little. I learned to live with unanswered questions, telling myself they didn't matter as long as the larger picture looked intact. But after finding that envelope, all those brushed-off moments came rushing back, collecting like storm clouds. I felt a pressure building inside me, the kind that makes it impossible to sit still. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed answers, and that meant starting with the drive that would change everything. I woke before sunrise, long before my alarm, with a tightness in my chest that made it impossible to stay in bed. The house felt colder than usual, almost hollow, as if it already knew what I was about to do. I grabbed my keys, the copied address, and a jacket I barely thought about. My hands shook as I locked the front door behind me, but my steps felt strangely steady. Something in me had shifted, and there was no turning back. The sky was still dark when I pulled onto the highway. As the first thin line of morning light stretched across the horizon, it felt like it was exposing everything I had tried to bury, mile after mile. I replayed moments I had avoided thinking about for years. The late returns home, the vague explanations, the quiet voice inside me that always asked if something wasn't quite right. I remembered how quickly I used to silence that voice, telling myself I was being dramatic or ungrateful. The road stretched endlessly through open fields, their emptiness mirroring the unraveling happening inside me. Every mile brought me closer to answers I wasn't sure I wanted, but knew I needed. The closer I got to the countryside, the more the landscape shifted. Farmhouses spaced far apart, long gravel driveways, rusted fences catching the morning sun. It felt like I was driving straight into the heart of a truth that had been waiting for me. When my GPS announced a turn toward a narrow dirt road, my pulse jumped. I slowed as the outline of a farmhouse came into view, quiet and unassuming beneath the soft morning light. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I was only moments away from seeing something that would change my life forever, and as I crept closer, I braced myself for whatever waited in that yard. I eased my car onto the shoulder of the narrow dirt road, far enough back that no one in the farmhouse could see me. The morning light had settled over the yard in a soft, golden haze, the kind that should have felt peaceful. Instead, it pressed down on my chest like a weight. I rolled the window down just enough to hear the breeze moving through the trees, trying to steady myself as I watched the quiet house. A few minutes passed before the front door opened. A young woman stepped outside, maybe in her late 20s, with a tired but gentle look about her. She wore an oversized sweatshirt and jeans, the kind of clothes someone only wears at home. Comfortable, familiar. She crossed the yard with the ease of someone who belonged there. I felt something inside me twist. This was no distant cousin in need of charity. This was someone who lived here. Then Thomas walked out after her. Seeing him so casually in that yard made the world tilt. He looked relaxed, almost lighter than I had seen him in years. He moved toward the woman with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. There was no hesitation, no guarded expression, none of the heaviness he carried at home. It was like watching a version of him I had never known, before I could even process that. The front door swung open again and a small child burst into the yard. Bright hair, tiny sneakers, laughter carrying across the open space. The child ran straight to Thomas, and he bent down, scooped them up, and held them with a tenderness I hadn't seen from him in so long. The woman smiled at them, the kind of soft smile shared by people who have built a life together. My heart cracked in a way that felt physical, like something inside me tearing apart. All the stories, all the excuses, all the little red flags I had ignored, they formed a single, brutal truth. This wasn't charity. This was a second life, a second family. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to breathe through the shock. I wasn't ready to walk into that yard. Not yet. I needed a moment. Just one, to pull myself together before taking the next step. The walk from my car to the farmhouse felt both endless and far too quick. Every step landed with a strange clarity, as if the gravel beneath my shoes wanted to remind me that this was real. The morning air was cool, almost sharp, and I tried to breathe steadily, even though my heart felt like it was trying to outrun me. I kept my eyes on the door, on the life Thomas had built without me, and told myself I was ready, even if that wasn't entirely true. When I reached the porch, the door opened before I could knock. Rachel stood there, The same young woman I had watched from the car. Her expression shifted from confusion to something softer, something that looked like dread. For a moment we simply stared at each other, both trying to understand what the other represented. I could see her trying to piece together who I might be, and then I saw understanding flicker across her face. Thomas appeared behind her. Panic moved through him so visibly that it felt like a physical force. His shoulders tightened. His eyes darted away from mine, and for the first time, I saw the full weight of his double life settling on him. I felt strangely calm in that moment, as though my emotions had tucked themselves away just to let me function. Rachel stepped aside, and I walked into a home that should have been unfamiliar, but somehow wasn't. The living room was warm, lived in, filled with little touches that told me Thomas spent real time here. Boots by the door, a half-finished mug on a side table, framed photos on the wall. I moved closer to those photos, taking in images of the child I had seen outside, smiling between Thomas and Rachel, year after year. Holidays, birthdays, ordinary afternoons. Rachel's voice came to me not as words, but as a quiet confession I felt more than heard. She hadn't known about me in the beginning. She believed the story he crafted for her, just as I believed the one he crafted for me. Standing in that room, surrounded by the evidence of his second life, I felt the truth settle deeper. I wasn't dealing with just one betrayal. There were layers, financial, emotional, and still hidden ones waiting to surface. And I knew the next ones would hurt even more. I noticed the financial clues almost immediately, though at first I couldn't quite make sense of them. A stack of unopened mail sat on a small desk near the kitchen, and beside it lay a neat binder, one of those heavy, zippered ones people use for taxes or major purchases. Something about the way it was placed, almost deliberately accessible, pulled me toward it. My hands felt numb as I unzipped it and opened to the first page. Rows of dates, amounts, and notes stared back at me. Not rough estimates or casual scribbles. These were carefully logged payments, expenses tied to this house, this life, this family, weeks of groceries here, medical bills there, rent, repairs, school supplies. And each line carried numbers far larger than anything Thomas had ever described when he talked about helping a cousin get back on their feet. The totals formed a pattern I couldn't ignore, a truth that settled over me like ice. Flipping further, I found a section labeled in his handwriting, money transferred from accounts I thought were untouched. Then I saw it documentation of the refinance on our Asheville home, the home I loved, the home I felt safe in. I remembered how he'd reassured me, saying refinancing would allow us to tackle a few projects and build a small cushion. He spoke with such certainty that I believed him, comforting myself with the idea that marriage required trust. But here, laid out in black and white, were the redirected funds. Large sums moved quietly over the years. My stomach twisted as I realized the truth he hadn't refinanced to help us. He had refinanced to support this second life, this second family, all while letting me believe we were tightening our belts together. The horror wasn't a dramatic rush. It was a slow, crushing collapse inside me, a recognition that the ground beneath my marriage had been hollow for longer than I understood. This wasn't just infidelity. It was financial devastation, planned and executed with precision. And as I closed the binder with shaking hands, I knew something even darker was coming. This level of deception didn't happen without an endgame. I kept replaying the numbers in that binder, but even they didn't explain the hollow feeling growing in my chest. There was something deeper here, something intentional. My eyes drifted to a locked drawer in the same desk, the kind of drawer people use when they're hiding more than household bills. The key was taped underneath, almost carelessly. That carelessness alone sent a chill through me. Inside was a stack of folders, each labeled with a level of organization that made my stomach twist. The first held an updated will, one I had never seen. My name, once listed beside his on everything we owned, had been moved to a final line with a single note debt responsibility. The beneficiaries were now Rachel and the child. Seeing their names where mine had been for decades sent a cold shock through my spine. Next were insurance policies with recently changed beneficiaries, policies I didn't even know existed. He had increased the coverage significantly, but none of it was meant for me. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt tight, as if my body knew what my mind wasn't ready to understand. Then I found the offshore transfer documents. Accounts opened quietly. Funds moved slowly over the past 2 years, each transfer small enough to avoid detection but substantial enough to build something meaningful over time, something he planned for them, not for us. But nothing compared to the final folder. Medical records, test results, a diagnosis date, a prognosis that offered little hope. My husband, my partner for more than 20 years, was terminally ill, and he had known. The realization tore through me. He wasn't planning to leave me. He was planning to die. After making sure I would carry the debt, the fallout, the financial wreckage, he intended for his second family to be secure while I was left with nothing. I sat there, shaking, the papers trembling in my hands. The betrayal wasn't just emotional or financial, it was deliberate, calculated, final. And as the shock settled into something cold and steady, I knew I couldn't face this alone. The next step wouldn't be about confronting him. It would be about finding an unexpected ally in Rachel and deciding what came next. I remember sitting at Rachel's kitchen table, the two of us still trembling from everything we had uncovered. The silence between us felt heavy, almost brittle, as if one wrong word could shatter whatever fragile understanding was beginning to form. I kept my eyes on the grain of the wooden table, trying to steady my breathing, aware of her doing the same across from me. We were strangers bound together by a lie neither of us had asked for. At first, I felt a sharp tension in my chest whenever I looked at her. She represented everything I had just lost, even if she hadn't meant to. But as the minutes passed, I began to see her differently. She looked exhausted, blindsided, and deeply hurt in a way that mirrored my own pain. She wasn't the architect of this mess. She was another victim standing in the debris. We began sharing fragments of our stories, not in a neat or orderly way, but through scattered reflections. I told her about the years of excuses and vague explanations, how I had talked myself into trusting him again and again. She told me, in her own quiet way, about the picture he had painted for her, one where he was a man trying to rebuild his life, not destroy mine. Hearing her describe how she learned the truth made something in me soften. I realized she had been deceived just as skillfully, just as thoroughly. Somewhere in that exchange, the tension shifted. Instead of looking at her with blame, I started seeing her as the only person who truly understood the depth of this betrayal, the weight of it, the shock, the way it hollowed out everything you thought you knew. By the time we both lifted our eyes, there was a silent recognition between us. We weren't enemies. We weren't rivals. We were two women standing in the wreckage of the same man's choices. And in that quiet, shared moment, we understood that we would face whatever came next together. Rachel and I gathered everything we had, every document, every record, every quiet piece of proof that showed the life Thomas had built in shadows. I remember standing in her kitchen that morning, feeling both drained and strangely steady. There was no rage left, just a firm, cold resolve. We drove into town together, two women bound not by friendship but by truth, carrying the weight of what he'd done in a single overstuffed folder. Walking into the attorney's office felt surreal. I had spent years trusting that Thomas understood laws and contracts better than I ever could. Now I was placing his own careful deceptions on a polished wooden desk, listening as the attorney sifted through them with growing concern. I watched his expression shift, not with shock, but with the realization that what we brought wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern, a deliberate scheme. The process moved quickly after that. Investigators were contacted. The authorities reached out to financial institutions. Within days, accounts were frozen, and transactions he hoped would stay hidden were pulled into the light. His offshore transfers triggered further review. His firm learned the truth, and the consequences hit fast. His license was suspended pending investigation. The man who once lectured me about responsibility and ethics could no longer step foot in his own office. News traveled quietly but efficiently through his professional circle. The polished image he had spent years cultivating cracked almost overnight, and watching it happen brought no satisfaction, just a heavy, exhausted clarity. This collapse wasn't victory. It was the natural outcome of choices he had made again and again. I felt grief threaded through the anger, sorrow mixed with vindication. Justice was necessary, but it wasn't easy. It required facing the truth of the man I had loved, not the man I had imagined. As the legal wheels continued turning, I realized something important. Exposing his lies didn't fix my life. It only cleared the fog around it. What came next? Rebuilding, healing, reclaiming what was left. That would be my work, and I knew I was finally ready to begin it. The months that followed felt strangely quiet, as if the world had finally stopped spinning out from under me. I remember waking up one morning and realizing that the constant tension in my chest had eased. There was no new crisis waiting, no hidden envelope, no restless wondering about where Thomas might be. The silence felt unfamiliar at first, but slowly it became comforting, like a space I could finally breathe in. I spent those early weeks sorting through the pieces of my life. I met with financial advisors, untangled the mess he left behind, and built a plan that belonged to me alone. It wasn't easy, but each small victory, every form filed, every account reclaimed, felt like a stitch pulling me back together. I saw, for the first time in years, how capable I was when fear wasn't steering my decisions. Emotionally, the healing came in waves. Some days I grieved the marriage I thought I had. Other days I felt grateful that the truth had finally surfaced, even if it shattered everything. In that mix of loss and relief, I found clarity. The end of that life was also the beginning of a new one. I moved into a small townhouse on the edge of Asheville, a place with wide windows that pour sunlight onto the hardwood floors every morning. I started a simple ritual: coffee at sunrise, watching the sky shift while the world wakes up. That quiet moment reminds me daily that I survived something heavy and came out standing. Rebuilding hasn't been glamorous, but it has been honest. And somewhere in the steadiness of these new routines, I've rediscovered my own worth. If you've lived through something similar, or if you're walking through your own storm right now, I hope you'll share your story below. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Looking back, I see a journey I never expected to walk, one that broke me open but also taught me the strength of standing in my own truth. I'm grateful you stayed with me through every step of it. If my story reminded you of your own pain or your own healing, I hope you'll share it. Your voice matters here. Have you ever faced a moment that changed everything? Tell me in the comments, and let's hold space for one another.